All right, welcome everyone to this afternoon's presentation of looking back at the Negro Leagues with Dr. Leslie Heafy. Welcome, Dr. Heafy, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much.
Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Dr. Heafy. Dr. Heafy is an associate professor of history at Kent State Stark. She is the author and editor of 6 books, as well as numerous articles and book chapters on the Negro Leagues, women's baseball, and the New York Mets. She is vice president for the Society of American Baseball Research and on the board of the International Women's Baseball Center. So welcome, Dr. Heafy. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And thanks everybody for being here. Always a great pleasure to get a chance to talk about the Negro Leagues. And today we're going to take a walk through Negro League history as it relates to Ohio primarily, to give it a little bit of a focus. And so I'm going to switch over to sharing my screen with you. So if you bear with me for a moment while I get that moving here. So hopefully you can see my screen. Somebody will tell me if you can't. But we want to look at the question of Ohio's participation, Ohio's connections to Black baseball, and then to the official Negro Leagues. And it's, I think, much broader and wider than most people expect. And so we're going to take a little bit of a walk through. And my goal is simply to give you an introduction, and hopefully maybe some of you will get excited and interested and want to go do some learning on your own about some of the numerous teams and players that came out of Ohio and connected to both Black baseball prior to 1920 and then the Negro Leagues from 1920 onward. And of course, the Cleveland Buckeyes is probably the team that most people know best. That's the jersey I am wearing today, proudly, with the 1945 patch for the years the Cleveland Buckeyes won the Negro League World Series. And so that's the team that most people first think of. But we're going to take it backwards to look into the 19th century and then move our way forward to talk about people like Moses Fleetwood Walker and Ted Tolles, who are shown here on the slide, who are both Ohioans. First thing that I will tell you is based on the research of particularly Dr. James Brunson, who came out with a 3-volume work just in the last couple of years, identifying over 60 Black baseball clubs in Ohio in the 19th century alone. And that's an astronomical number, I think, for people to think about. There's about 66, actually. And just to give you a couple of examples, a lot of them are associated with some of our colleges here in Ohio. Won't surprise you that Oberlin certainly had a baseball team, and one of those was the Resolutes in the late 1860s, right after the Civil War, with one of their players, the young African-American player on their team was Simpson Younger. Simpson Younger went on to be involved in the law and ended up being involved in some of the court cases that ultimately led to the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision. So he's associated with some of those court cases later on. A couple of other examples. Since I'm sitting here in Canton, Ohio, I thought I'd mention the Live Oaks, which was a team organized in the 1880s, and we have a number of newspaper articles talking about them in 1889, organized by Harry Hall. And as was typical of many of these teams, they're going to be playing both black and white opponents. And so we have one account about the Live Oaks winning a game 10-9. They were behind 9-3 and scored the necessary runs to win that game in the bottom of the last inning, and so came away with a big win in one of their contests against a white team. There was an active baseball club in Cincinnati. They were listed in the newspapers as calling themselves the Colored Champions of Ohio in 1885, organized by Charlie Williams, who also played first base for the team. And yes, if you're looking at that slide and you see baseball as 2 words, that's not a mistake. That was typically how it was written in the 19th century. And so, and then I love this one. The team name was simply called Z, and it was listed in the newspapers as the Z Baseball Club, coming out of Cleveland in the 1880s. So just a couple of examples of some of these early, as I say, over 60 baseball clubs in Ohio. When we think about Black baseball in the 19th century, we're talking about mostly independent teams playing. There are a couple of attempts to create what they would have called then, one of them was called the Colored League. without much success, simply because of the difficulties of travel and other related things in the 19th century. When we look at, okay, there we go. Here is a picture of the Oberlin College team in 1881. And you will notice that there are two African-American players on the Oberlin College team, Moses Fleetwood Walker and his brother Weldy. Moses was the catcher. Weldy was a outfielder, played mostly in right field. Walker is going to go on to continue to have an extended baseball career through the 1880s for a number of different teams, but he got his start here at Oberlin and then is going to go on to also play at the University of Michigan because in 1883 he will move from Oberlin to the University of Michigan. Walker and his brother are considered to be among the very first to play African-Americans to play Major League Baseball, because in the 1880s, the American Association was considered a major league. And so we're going to see Walker, and here's a headline from the Toledo paper talking about Walker being the first to play in the major leagues in 1884 when he played for the Toledo White Stockings. The other picture there's Walker playing for the University of Michigan baseball team in 1882. Walker comes from Mount Pleasant, Ohio. He was born there in 1856. He died in Cleveland in 1924. In addition to his extended baseball career, Walker had a very fascinating life. Walker owned a number of businesses, including a hotel and opera house down in the Cadiz area. He was also, right at the turn of the century, he ended up spending a year in jail for mail fraud as he worked for the post office. But most interestingly, in 1891, given conditions of the day, he was actually arrested and tried and acquitted on a murder charge. Got in an altercation with a number of individuals, and he was acquitted on the charge of self-defense. They had been drinking, and so the accident occurred. Walker, as I say, played as catcher. And the interesting thing about Walker as a catcher in the 19th century is to think about most of the teams that Walker is going to play on. He was either the only black player or one of maybe two or three. And so he's catching white pitchers. And in most of the 19th century, catchers, unlike today, didn't have the glove and all the protection that we think about. And so it's kind of amazing that Walker hit as a career in the 250s, which would be, most of us would find that pretty acceptable for a player today. But that's often with white pitchers not listening to him making calls on the kinds of pitches they wanted. At one point, you see pictures of his hands, and it's clear that most of his fingers were probably broken at one time or another. From the catching without a glove or catching with what would be the equivalent of what we might think of as a glove we'd wear outside when it's cold outside in the middle of winter. And so Walker also wrote a book called Our Home Colony, in which he talked about American race relations and issues and concerns and ideas that he had about returning to Africa. So very interesting beyond just his baseball career, but usually remembered as one of the very first to play in the major leagues before the color line was dropped after 1884. And then we don't see player until Jackie Robinson with the Dodgers in 1947, playing on what we would recognize as a major league team. So this Walker, there's now a historical marker if you go to Toledo outside the downtown stadium, commemorating Walker's playing for the Toledo White Stockings in the 1884 season. A couple of other early players that have a connection to Ohio who are kind of well known in the Negro League world. Grant Johnson, pictured here, born in 1874, as you see, died in 1963, better known as Home Run Johnson. He was born in Findlay, Ohio, played mostly in the infield, best known for his home run hitting. And if you look at him as a player, you might not expect that given his size, but that's what he was known for. Apocryphal stories about his power. One article talks about him hitting 60 home runs in one season. which gives you a sense of how they viewed his power. He played for a number of different teams, gave you a few examples: the Page Fence Giants out of Adrian, Michigan, the Cuban X Giants, and the Philadelphia Giants. As was typical of many of the early Black players, moved around a great deal from team to team due to finances, sometimes due to race issues and some of the concerns related to that. And so Johnson, probably the most famous team that he played on was the Page Fence Giants in the 1890s, an interesting team that was formed in Adrian, Michigan. One of the cool things about them was they had their own railroad car, and they traveled with the name of the company on the outside of it. And they actually, because they worked for a fence company, they actually carried their own fencing with them, so they could create the sense of a stadium pretty much anywhere they went. And Johnson was a part of that very famous team in the 1890s. One of my favorite early players and managers is this gentleman here, King Solomon White. Was born in 1868 in Bel Air, Ohio. Worked as a manager and a player, but best known really for his role as a historian. And in fact, that's what helped elect him to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 2006. He was one of the 17 players and managers and owners who was elected in 2006. He wrote a book called Sol White's Official Baseball Guide, and came out right around the turn of the century. And his intent in writing that book for the time period was to make people aware of just how many Black baseball players and Black teams there were playing in the 19th century, to sort of go against the idea at the time that there just weren't Black players playing, or they weren't good enough, there wasn't interest. And he really wrote this to try to show that history. And so while it was important at the time, it became even more important in more recent history as one of our best early sources to learn about in the 19th century. And so his role as historian is really important. It's a fascinating book. It's been republished, so if anybody is looking for something to read about the 19th century, this is a great piece. He also worked as a columnist for the Black newspaper, the New York Amsterdam News, for a time being as well. And so, as I say, elected to the Hall of Fame in 2006. When we look at teams in Ohio, as we start to move forward and take ourselves out of the 19th century to sort of show you the scope of all of this, we know that there are over 70 players who played in the Negro Leagues who were born in Ohio and went on to play for both Ohio teams and other teams, everything from the Kansas City Monarchs to the Homestead Grays. But what I'm going to do is I walk through the next part of this presentation, and before anybody gets worried as you see these lists, I want to show you titles of some of the teams that played in Ohio during the time period of the Negro Leagues, which is essentially from 1920 to 1948-49, is what we're looking at here today. And I want you to pay attention to something, because even though I'm not giving, if this was my class, I would be giving you a quiz at the end, to see if you notice anything interesting in the teams that I am showing you about Ohio, and who has the most, which city gets credit for the most Ohio teams in the Negro Leagues, because it might surprise you, it might not. But when we're talking about Ohio teams, the Negro Leagues officially started in 1920. In fact, their founding date was February 13th, so just a few days ago. And one of those original 8 teams was the Dayton Marcos. They were officially part of the Negro Leagues in 1920 and again in 1926. They'd been around for a number of years before 1920 and will continue long after. That was often typical of Negro League teams. They would come and go in and out of league existence. They would barnstorm as independent teams in between. Sometimes they would move cities, and so they might start in one city in one year and end up in 3 or 4 other cities over the course of their time as a team, due to finances, lack of stadiums, ownership, variety of different reasons. The Marcos are a team we don't know a great deal about, but we do have a couple of pictures, which I'll show you here in a moment. In that early league, we also have Cincinnati coming in with the Cincinnati Cuban Stars in 1921. There were a number of Negro League teams named the Cuban Stars. The Cuban Stars moved around and called different cities homes from year to year, and sometimes there were two Cuban Star teams, and they were sometimes just referred to as the Cuban Stars West and the Cuban Stars East. And so the Cuban Stars of 1921 were a part of that first Negro National League formed by Rube Foster and others. We have the Columbus Buckeyes also playing for part of that season in 1921. So team coming won't be the first or won't be the last team coming out of Columbus. Cleveland will have their Tate Stars for 2 seasons in the early 20s. And the Tate Stars are the beginning of a number of teams coming out of Cleveland and a number of attempts by various Cleveland business owners and entities to try to build stadiums for just their own black teams rather than using white teams stadiums or open fields or college stadiums and things of that sort, which was pretty typical at the time. We have the Toledo Tigers in 1923, and then the Cleveland Browns that take over from the Tate Stars in 1924. So already in this very first section of the Negro National League, you can see we've got a number of teams coming out of Ohio playing, giving opportunities to lots of young men. This is simply a picture of the Cuban team traveled from Cincinnati to New York to Pittsburgh, played in a variety of cities. And so giving you a little bit of a look at the Cuban team. And then this is the team from Dayton, the Dayton Marcos, owned by John Matthews, sitting there in the center of the picture. Manager of the team, and this was again a typical kind of idea, was Jim Taylor, but he also played first base. And you'll notice when you look at the team picture, the number of players that are there. And that's often a question that people ask, how many players did a lot of these teams have? And typically might be anywhere from 14 to 16. And so a lot of players had played multiple positions. It's not like today where pitchers, they pitch 5 innings and then you have all of the various relief pitchers. Pitchers pitch complete games, come back the next day and pitch complete game, or they pitch a complete game the next day they're playing in the outfield, some of these kinds of things. So this was a fairly typical kind of idea. So the Marcos are one of those good examples of a team that came in and out of the league, but played in the Dayton area for many, many years. Bill Sloan was one of their more well-known local players. Became very well known because of a big flood that they had in Dayton and the help that he gave during that flood. This is an advertisement from the newspaper. I was talking about Cleveland and the attempts to build their own ballparks. The Cleveland Tate Stars in the early 20s. You can see here an attempt to design and build their own ballpark. See the cost at $25,000 for the stocks, an effort to build that park that didn't actually ever get completed, but that was the idea. And here's a newspaper article of the grand opening of Tate Field. It was completed, at least parts of the outfield where all of the seating was not. You can see another typical thing, opening parades, music by bands, these were always big occasions, and they were playing a team out of Pittsburgh called the Keystones. And there they are as part of the team anyway. A couple of the players were missing from that picture of the Cleveland Tate Stars. Few more of the Ohio teams, and you'll see some names repeating and those kinds of things, but we have the Cleveland Elites in 1926, the Cleveland Hornets in 1927, that's one of my favorite names, the Cleveland Tigers in 1928, the Columbus Keystones coming in 1930, the Cincinnati Giants in the early 30s, 31 and 33, the Cleveland Cubs in 1931 and 32, and you'll notice on some of these, if you go back to look in newspapers and things, you'll find that some of these names were shared by football teams as well. So sometimes doing research, it can be really interesting. You think you're reading about a baseball team and you find out that you're actually reading about a football team as you get into some of the descriptions and articles. And there we have the Cleveland Stars coming in 1932. Okay, so nearly to over 15 teams playing in Ohio by this point. One of the teams that we know the least about in most cases is the Akron Black Tyrites, coming in 1933, associated with obviously the tire companies and things in the Akron area, but not a lot known about that particular team. Newspapers did not tend to sometimes cover the smaller teams, and so Columbus Bluebirds also playing in 1933, Cleveland Red Sox, the Cincinnati Tigers, the Columbus Elite Giants in 1935, the Cleveland Bears in 1939 and 1940. So I hope you're maybe seeing an answer to the question that I asked you at the start of this with some of the Ohio teams, but it gives you an idea of who we're talking about. And then we have the Toledo Crawfords, 1939. This was the Pittsburgh Crawfords that moved over to Toledo for a short period of time, owned and operated by a local businessman by the name of Hank Rigney. Rigney was involved with a traveling softball team as well. I actually had the opportunity to meet Rigney's widow many, many, many years after the team went out of existence, and got a chance to talk to her a little bit about her husband's involvement with the Toledo Crawfords, which was very interesting to get a chance to chat with her about that, and her husband's involvement with the team in the 1930s and the softball team as well. Now, one of the other interesting things that a lot of these teams did, of course, is they traveled all over. They played league games. They played barnstorming games against any opponents they could find. And so 1933 and 1934, just as an example, we have the Pittsburgh Crawfords and the Homestead Grays, well-known teams with lots of championships in the 1930s, coming through Gallipolis in southern Ohio, playing at the Silver Bridge Field, and that is the Silver Bridge, where the field is at the far side of that. And the newspapers talk about the presence of Ray Brown, who later in the Hall of Fame, Double Duty Radcliffe, and another Hall of Famer, Buck Leonard. So the opportunity for local communities to see some of the well-known ball players from the big league Negro League teams. Double Duty Radcliffe, of course, kind of unique individual, his nickname earned for catching and pitching doubleheaders. Lived to the ripe well over the age of 100, had lots of opportunities to sit and chat with and listen to Double Duty's stories of his days of playing. But this was very typical and an opportunity for small towns to see some of the best that the Negro Leagues had to offer. The manager of the local team actually in 1935 signed for a short series these three players to play for the Silverbridge team in at least 2 games where they appeared in newspaper articles playing for the hometown team. And so that also happens sometimes where you will see players appearing on different rosters at different points in time. This is the Cincinnati Tigers of 1936, and I wanted to show you this picture simply because we don't have a lot of pictures of some of the ways that the Negro League teams traveled. A lot of times their travel was by individual car. You might get 6 or 7 cars that people piled into, but occasionally teams had their own buses. And this is one of those buses. And so the Cincinnati Tigers, what we find is some of those buses found their way from team to team. And so some of them, they were sold and shared by the different teams. Pittsburgh Crawfords had a bus, but the personal cars was the most common way. When they had the buses, the advantage, of course, was for the players having a little more room to spread out, to relax, to sleep. Often thinking about travel for a lot of these teams is they didn't have places to stay. Black hotels, one opportunity, finding homes that they could stay in, but a lot of times they had to sleep as they traveled. They washed their uniforms and hung them out the windows sometimes of the vehicles and things like that to adjust to the conditions they found when they were traveling. And so buses, this was a bonus. And so sometimes one of the players served as the bus driver. The traveling secretary, if a team had one, could sometimes be the bus driver as well. Ohio wasn't finished yet with their teams. As we move into the 40s, before integration and with Jackie Robinson's involvement, the Cincinnati Clowns playing in the 40s. We have the Cincinnati that then become the Cleveland Buckeyes starting in 1942. And of course, they will remain as the Cleveland Buckeyes all the way through to almost the end of the decade. We're going to come back and talk about them. So you can see from 43 to 48, called Cleveland home, and then they will move to Louisville after by the 1949 season. The Toledo Cubs played in the United States League, which was a short-lived league in 45 and 46 due to the issues of integration. The Cincinnati Crescents in 1946. And then the Cleveland Clippers in 1946. So wide array of teams playing in Ohio. And as I mentioned earlier, the one most famous of all of them is going to end up being the Cleveland Buckeyes. But here is another newspaper article just to give you a little bit of, this is the Cincinnati Clowns. And as you can see, they were playing against the Naval Great Lakes team. And this is the team that Larry Doby played on. Larry Doby, of course, goes on to integrate the Cleveland Indians. And so in this particular case, the Cincinnati Clowns from the Negro American League are going to defeat the Great Lakes team. But you can see Doby's name listed there in the article itself in 1944. And so this is the Cincinnati Clowns. Here is some of the players from the Cleveland team with the bus that they had when they traveled, relaxing obviously between games as they are traveling from destination to destination. And so, but here is the team that everybody talks about when we talk about Ohio's connection. This is the Cleveland Buckeyes, winners of the 1945 World Series. And so advertisement for the Cleveland Buckeyes, showing the games played in September against the Homestead Grays. And the interesting thing about this particular team is some will argue that when you look back, this might have been one of the biggest upsets in World Series, Negro League World Series. The Homestead Grays on paper were probably without a doubt the best team, and they were easily defeated by the Cleveland Buckeyes. As you can see, 4 games, it was a 4-game sweep. 2 of them shutouts. The Homestead Grays had not been shut out that entire season by another Negro League team. And so for the Cleveland Buckeyes to accomplish that was, and so it's even more amazing to me that people don't know much about the Cleveland Buckeyes when you think about what they were able to accomplish that particular season. 2 of the key leading players on that team were Quincy Troop, the catcher, and Sammy the Jethro. You might recognize the name Jethro if you're a Major League Baseball fan, because Jethro went on to play for 3 seasons with the Boston Braves. So he did get a chance to play in the white major leagues and a little bit later in his career. And so Quincy Troop and Jethro were 2 of the leading hitters on that team. And here again is Quincy Troop with John Cowan, and what some would argue was sort of the player that really brought the team together in 45. Angelino Canizares, who was the shortstop, brought in by Quincy Troop to join the team. And when you think about sometimes like the missing piece on a team that sort of brings was that young, fast player that just brought a new spirit and energy to the team in 1945. Jethro, of course, in addition to before he got the chance to play for the Boston Braves, was one of a number of players with Robinson who got a call from the Boston Red Sox and invited to a tryout in 1945. This was one of a couple of major league tryouts that players were invited to that never amounted to anything. They were more about show and more about answering the calls for integration at that point in time, but he did get invited to a Red Sox tryout in 1945. The Buckeyes played at League Park, and this is a old picture of the grandstand area and the ticket booth area for League Park. You may have seen today that there was an article just put out where they've done a digital recreation of League Park and what it might have looked like from what has been recovered. It looks like I just lost my PowerPoint. I apologize for that. I don't know what just happened. That was interesting. I apologize for that. I'm not sure. Let me see if I can get it back. There we go. So, okay, it's gonna give me a, so League Park, showing you League Park, and the Buckeyes, as I say, went on to win that World Series with Quincy Troop and Sammy Jethro as the key players. The pitching staff was led by two brothers, George and Willie Jefferson were the two pitchers who led the way for the Buckeyes as they came out on top in that world opportunity for the World Series. The other leading players on the team, Parnell Woods, who served as both the third baseman and the captain for the club. Parnell Woods was a heavy hitter and helped lead the team in terms of, it's not going to let me. I'm gonna, oh, there it goes. Okay. This is Parnell Woods, the third baseman and the captain for the team. We also had Quincy Troop, as I mentioned, and then Lloyd Davenport in the outfield, Ducky Davenport, Avelino Canizares, Gene Bremer, star pitcher for the team, won one of those games against the Homestead Grays, Willie Grace, Sammy Jethro, who went on to play for the Boston Braves, Archie Ware, the first baseman, and then George and Willie Jefferson were the other pitching stars for the team. In fact, Gene Bremer is one of those players that I'm hoping to see eventually put into Greater Cleveland Sports Hall of Fame for his contributions to Cleveland's baseball history from the Cleveland Buckeyes side of things. Sammy Jethro also had an opportunity in 1945 to play with Jackie Robinson on the Robinson All-Stars. Sometimes Robinson, Page, others would put together all-star teams to play against just any opponent, but also to play against major league all-star teams. Dizzy Dean all-stars, Bob Feller had an all-star team, and so they would travel in the off-season and play against one another. And so this was the American All-Stars of 1945, and so Jethro played on that team. Cleveland returned to the Negro League World Series in 1947, and this time they played the New York Cubans in the 1947 World Series. Unfortunately, the result was not as they had hoped as it was in 1945. In 1947, they lost to the New York Cubans 4-1. Bremer again pitching for the Buckeyes as he had in 1945. Chet Brewer was the other major pitcher for that particular team. Couple of other key players, their shortstop Al Smith, fine fielder, great third baseman in Leon Kelman, and then Youngstown's Ted Tolles was also on that team. The Buckeyes often played independent teams, and one of the teams that commonly Negro League teams played was a team called the House of David. The House of David was a religious team out of the Michigan area, and Chet Brewer, as you can see in this, also played for the Kansas City Monarchs in addition to pitching for the Buckeyes. So, but they lost in that World Series 4-1. And here is the New York Cuban team. And I thought you might recognize at least one of the names of the players from the Cuban team, because the star on that, one of the stars on that team, of course, was Minnie Minoso, who went on to have a very long career with the Chicago White Sox, known as the Cuban Comet when he played for the White Sox, still not yet in the Hall of Fame. Other members of that team, if you are familiar at all with the Negro League history, Dave Impo Barnhill, Ray Noble, Rabbit Martinez, and then Louis Tiant Sr. Son, of course, got to play in the major leagues, but this is Louis Tiant Sr. pitched for the New York Cubans in the latter part of the through the 1940s. And so he was a part of this winning team as well. Minoso was part of the New York Cubans for about 3 seasons and was there for them winning the 1947 Negro League World Series. 1948 was the last full season for the Cleveland Buckeyes in the city of Cleveland. This is a picture of the team sitting in the dugout at League Park. Three of the players identified here: Hank Presswood, who was their second baseman shortstop, who played for both the Buckeyes and the Kansas City Monarchs; Tommy Harris, their catcher; and Sammy Thompson, who was one of the pitchers on the 48 team. After the 48 season, the Buckeyes moved on to Louisville and spent the 49 season in Louisville. And so that was a fairly common occurrence with the Negro League teams. And so I asked you a question when I sort of started all of this, to ask you which city in the state of Ohio had the most, by far, the most teams. And so hopefully you all saw that it was, of course, Cleveland. And the question that usually gets asked at this point is, why so many different teams? And of course, the answer to that is partly, as I said, due to finances. Difficulty in being able to sometimes make paychecks, some of that due to the presence of fans, presence of a black newspaper or not, which helped support and get word out about games, difficulty in trying to find stadiums, owners that didn't necessarily have the money to invest long-term, turned it over to other people. And so Cleveland had a long history of having teams, and oftentimes when you look at the rosters from year to year to year, some of the players are exactly the same, so it's clear that the team name has just changed, but sometimes it's an entirely different team. In the case of Toledo, when we see the Crawfords, that was actually the Pittsburgh team that had moved over to Toledo for part of the season. So we see a lot of movement of teams throughout the years. Most teams played league games anywhere from about 60 to 80 games, and yet we know that Negro League teams typically played upwards of 200 games. So that gives you a sense of the number of independent games that they played in order to make their paychecks and to be able to pay all of their expenses. But it was also simply because they enjoyed playing and they traveled. And so if you're traveling from New York to Cleveland, you're going to stop and play along the way if you have those kinds of opportunities, or if you're coming up from the South and from spring training, sometimes they did these kinds of things. So that's a little bit of a look at what happened and some of the connections to Ohio. I will mention that in the 1930s, one of the Cleveland teams in 1933 actually had a female player for a short period of time playing first base. Isabel Baxter was playing on that team. And so that's a little bit of a unique connection as well. She wasn't from Ohio as far as we can tell, but she did play for a short period of time, went on then to have a long softball career after she played for part of a season with the Cleveland Tigers at that time. So at this point, I am happy to open it up and take if there are any questions that I can answer, because there's lots we can talk about. But I wanted to give you a sort of broad overlook of what Ohio's connections to Black baseball and the Negro Leagues were. So I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Dr. Heafy. If you have questions, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and just type your questions in, and then Dr. Heafy will answer them.
And one thing I should mention while people are thinking about if there are questions or things, I also would mention that in December of this past year, Major League Baseball, of course, made an announcement about recognizing 7 of the Negro Leagues as major leagues. And so that certainly is going to change the way some of these teams and players are going to be more well-known moving forward. And so I just mentioned that if you were not aware of that particular. And so as a consequence of that idea, one of the things that I'm going to encourage the Cleveland Indians to think about, or the Cleveland baseball team to think about, is that they should be flying the Cleveland Buckeyes banner from their World Series in 1945 and recognize that team, since it is now recognized by the major leagues as a major league.
Okay, so we do have a question. It says, thanks for the presentation. I'm sure you've been to the museum in Kansas City. Is it worth it?
Oh, yes, I've been many times, and I would absolutely tell you it is definitely worth it. It is an opportunity to see and hear the timeline and to see some of the photographs. It gives you a wonderful introduction and overview of the entire history as you walk. It's not a huge building, but they've really maximized their space. One of the great pieces in the museum there now is their field of players, where they have essentially laid out a ball diamond, and they have statues of players for each of the positions, which is sort of how you end your visit. They just opened a new exhibit on the barrier breakers, the players who moved from the Negro Leagues to the various major league teams following Jackie Robinson. So we have Larry Doby, we have Satchel Paige, right, and the others, because the process of integration takes place from 1947 to 1959, with the Boston Red Sox being the last team to integrate in the major leagues. And so all of those stories and many others are told. And of course, it also shares space with the Jazz Museum, which is the other half of the building. And so you can actually go to both of those, which are both worth a visit.
All right, thank you. So we do have another question. Was the baseball field near Myers Lake ever used by the Negro League teams?
Not that I have yet found any articles. That's not, and that wouldn't be to say that it's not possible, but to date, not found anything that would indicate that that was the case.
Okay, another question. Would changing the Indians' name to Buckeyes be a cool tribute or appropriation?
Well, that's an interesting one, and that has been brought up. And in this particular case, I think it would be a nice tribute to, and it's certainly one possibility to recognize that team and the importance of that team to the city. Another idea that I have heard sort of thrown out there has been, which is an interesting one to think about. People have suggested the Cleveland Pages, using Paige for Satchel Paige, since Paige was one of those who helped integrate the Indians as well. So that's another interesting idea to think about.
That is very interesting. Okay, so we have not a question, but a comment. In 1950, Sam Jethro was the National League Rookie of the Year, and he was followed by Willie Mays in 1951, Joe Black in 52, and Jim Gilliam in 53, all four African Americans.
Yep, and of course Jackie Robinson before that. So they all it's an interesting thing, and those kinds of statistics and that kind of quality of play that we see as integration begins to happen really helped to solidify what anybody already knew, which was that there were plenty of players in the Negro Leagues who were fully capable and of the same caliber as those in the major leagues. And the number of those awards that are won by the players who, as they move into Major League Baseball, really put paid to the idea that some people had long used to try to keep the league separate, which was there wasn't players of quality. As I always tell my students, Jackie Robinson didn't come out of nowhere, right? And those kinds of numbers support that idea.
All right, so can you talk a bit about the end of the Negro Leagues?
Sure. So the Negro Leagues, remembering that there are multiple leagues over the course of the existence, by the time we hit the late 1940s, we're talking about the Negro American League for the most part, because the Negro National League will, and so the Negro Leagues really begin to decline after Jackie Robinson gets his start with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. And so the Negro Leagues will continue on from 47 to 1960. 1960 is really the last, there's some argument that people will make for a little bit beyond that, but 1960 is last time that you have actually more than one team playing. And so you can't really have a league if there's not more than one team playing. And so those last years of the Negro Leagues are really very different as we start to see more and more players making both the jump to the majors and also into minor leagues. And so after 1950, we begin to see that some of the quality will begin to decline. The number of teams starts to decline. There'll no longer be an all-star game and a World Series played after the early part of the 1950s. And so that certainly changes because we've had a World Series played since 1923 on and off, and then a all-star game since 1933. And so those kinds of things. And it's an interesting thing to think about, because the push for integration, certainly you could argue, had come from the very beginning, but a concerted effort starting in the 1930s, obviously helped by World War II significantly. But as the Negro Leagues start to lose their players to major league teams, whether it's the Dodgers, the Indians, et cetera, and we start to see them close, there's an interesting dilemma, for example, for the Negro League owners, who recognize what's beginning to happen and realizing that they want their players, and they don't want to be the ones to stand in the way of their players getting these opportunities. But at the same time, it also meant that their businesses were going away, that they were going to lose their teams. And we sometimes don't think about the integration of in that whole picture, as teams disappear means players who don't make the minors or the majors are no longer going to have a place to play. They're not going to have those jobs, but it also means that all the auxiliary hotels, things like that, are also going to be affected. And so owners like F.M. Manley, who owned the Newark Eagles and helped to push for major league teams to pay the Negro League owners for the players that they took into the majors, because Jackie Robinson, when the Kansas City Monarchs, they didn't get paid for Jackie Robinson, and so F.M. Manley is going to make that push to ensure that they at least got, which allowed some of the teams to continue on. As a result of the declining fan base for some of these teams, will start to fold as fans went to watch their major league teams. They went to watch the Brooklyn Dodgers and to watch Jackie play, or to watch Larry Doby. One of the interesting things that happens as a result in the mid-1950s, 53 to 54 and 55, we will see the Kansas City Monarchs and the Indianapolis Clowns sign 3 female players: Toni Stone, Connie Morgan, and Mamie Johnson. And the question that always gets asked is, were they signed purely as a publicity stunt, right, to try to shore up the fan base, or could they actually play? And the answer is probably a little bit of both, but they could definitely play, because we know that Toni Stone had played for a number of teams for many years before, in San Francisco, in the St. Paul area where she came from, and then down in New Orleans before she joined the Monarchs and the ABCs. And she's the first of the 3. Mamie Johnson as a fine pitcher for 2 seasons, and Connie Morgan was from the Philadelphia area, and she was a fantastic basketball player, in addition to being a baseball player, and played for both basketball and baseball in the Philadelphia area. So that's one of the interesting things that happens as a part of that decline of the Negro Leagues as well. So maybe a long answer to that question, but hopefully that answered it.
We have a couple of more. So seeing that statistics from the Negro Leagues will now be included in MLB statistics, do you see that as another way for people to become even more familiar with the players from that time?
Yeah, I think that's, at least that's the hope, I think it will, because all of a sudden there's going to be names that start to appear in the leaderboards and things like that people have never seen before. And so hopefully that will encourage people to want to go and find out about these players and who they are. And so I think that's one of the positives that we hope will come out of this. I think the one caution that I also see with all of this is the potential downside of seeing them really only by their statistics, and not recognizing the larger history of the Negro Leagues, and remembering that as they start to integrate these statistics into major league statistics, that we don't lose sight of why the Negro Leagues existed in the first place, and this idea that they were at one time. And so the importance is in people not just seeing them as statistics, but really looking into the stories and finding out who these players, owners, managers, and things were.
All right, thank you. And we do have one more question about how much money the players made at the time.
Well, it varied depending on the time frame that you're talking about, and it varied a little bit by team and a little bit by position. So, you know, Satchel Paige certainly made much more than most players, but you could say anywhere from a typical sort of everyday kind of player who wasn't a superstar making anywhere from maybe 125 to 175 upwards to 350 to 400 at the top end, between the 20s all the way through the 40s. So somewhere in those kinds of ranges. And a lot of it depended, as I say, pitchers tended to make a little bit more, catchers sometimes. And it sometimes depended, like the Kansas City Monarchs often had better paychecks than some of the smaller teams, just simply because they drew bigger crowds. They had Satchel Paige, among others. Homestead Grays, Pittsburgh Crawfords with Josh Gibson, certainly making more money, but somewhere in those kinds of ranges is what you typically see.
All right, it looks like those are all of the questions that we have. Again, some thank yous. So I would like to thank you as well. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. This presentation has been recorded, so it'll be available on the library's YouTube site later. If you know someone who maybe missed it and was interested in seeing it, they will be able to see it at youtube.com/starklibrary. And also, I would encourage you to go to the library's website, starklibrary.org. We have many more programs coming up in the spring. Look for a mailer in your mailboxes soon with information about upcoming events. Thank you for joining us.